This is Mark.
Almost 15 years ago, Mark stopped playing video games.
Honestly, I was your typical 360 era gamer. Halo, Gears of War, all the classics you'd run home from school to play with your friends online and voice chat. It was one of the most fun periods of my life, and yet, as I got older and we all drifted off to college, gaming just totally fell away from me. Outside of the last two Last of Us games, I haven't been engaged in gaming whatsoever since 2010. I love movies, manga, TV, anime, the works, right? I made talking about them my literal job here. But gaming is this whole other medium that I've left behind. It's a gap in my knowledge and a form of media I'm ashamed to say that I've lost. And so, this year, I kind of want to change that. I don't just want to be exposed to games again, I want to dive in deep, and more than anything, I want to fall in love with gaming again.
And well, if you know me, you know I don't do anything half-heartedly. When I wanted to become a pro wrestler, I quit my day job and spent years at professional gyms. When I wanted to pursue YouTube full-time, I dropped everything, hired a full-time animator, thumbnail artist, and so on.
So, rather than me just picking up some random game and hoping for the best, I decided to, once again, go all in. And that is where these guys come in.
Hello there. We don't live in the land of Guinness and potatoes with Mark, so we are animated.
Well, joke's on him, because I'm actually this tall in real life.
Now those 100% to scale guys are AJ and Tyson. They're part of the TNM crew and are usually tied up in scripting, editing, and other such boring stuff. But, as it just so happens, both of them have bona fide higher education in game design, software engineering, the works. So, rather than me jumping back into this hobby totally blind, I've decided to steal them away from their regular work and task them with my fate, with guiding me through the 15 years of gaming I've missed and reuniting me with this old hobby of mine.
And setting aside the insanity of paying two full-time professionals for the single purpose of playing video games, we took that task in full force. We delved through Mark's entire gaming history, tried to work out what it is he did and didn't like about those games in the past, everything.
But ultimately, if there's anything we know about Mark as a person, it's that he loves a good story. Ones with strong character work that convey their message using the medium to the best of their ability. And so, after much deliberation, we landed on the most natural starting point for Mark's journey.
And what they gave me was God of War.
On the day you were born, I made two knives. One for myself, one for you.
So I'm a man now, like you?
No, we are more than that. The responsibility is far greater.
Having only played a single game in almost a decade and a half, I was definitely somewhat relieved that my first venture back into the gaming ether felt remarkably familiar. A father-child duo exploring a mysterious and dangerous world within a predominantly narrative-driven story. Even I see the influences here. It really has been a long time since I've played games in any meaningful capacity. Not so long that I don't remember what an analog stick does, but certainly long enough that I've forgotten how to use them. A break from film and TV might feel jarring with some of its stylistic changes, but it won't impede my viewing. Gaming, on the other hand, is interactive. Any unfamiliarity directly affects my experience.
I keep forgetting I have a fucking shield. I'm an idiot. Fuck!
Here's the thing, while this is primarily Mark's quest to fall in love with gaming again, it's also part experiment for us. Experiment in the academic sense, and also in the twisted jigsaw, I want to play a game sense.
Mark's vague list of games he played back in the day didn't exactly offer us too much in the way of guidance, and honestly, we weren't really sure taste for him as a teenager were really going to carry over this many years later. We sat down to watch his entire 30-hour playthrough, not just so we can provide analysis and insight on his decisions, but also so we can learn exactly what he loves and guide our decision making for the next game.
But to do that in the purest sense, and frankly because we thought it'd be interesting, and okay, a little bit funny, we chose not to guide him at all through this playthrough. No tips, no guides, no hints, nothing. Just one man separated from a medium for almost 15 years, thrown into the deep end.
And as you saw, things went south far sooner than we expected.
It's all about perspective. I could be thinking of give me a story is the very easy, then it's easy, then it's normal. So give me a challenge is normal, we're going to give me a challenge.
You know, it's funny, when I first fired up the game and saw that I could choose a difficulty level, in my infinite wisdom, I decided hard mode was the move. Foolishly believing its narrative-driven similarities with The Last of Us meant it would play much the same. This would be the first of many, many mistakes I would make, as unbeknownst to me, God of War is not like The Last of Us, and it is in fact what I now know as a fully fledged action game. That means much more varied controls than I am used to, with a heavy emphasis on melee combat. Fortunately, I'm still an angry dad. Sure, I don't have a gun anymore, but what I do have is an axe, which, when thrown, is kind of a gun, so I'm sure my remaining third-person shooter chops will cut it.
Oh, fuck me, a stupid fuck. Oh, okay. No, me gusta.
I fucking moved!
Okay.
I dodged! Fuck! Thankfully, however, the actual presentation of the game's story did feel pretty familiar from the get-go, which is certainly good given I knew nothing about the series going into it. Seriously, I didn't even know Kratos' name, and while my hired gremlins offered me a quick primer on the original game's story, I opted not to read it, instead more interested in seeing whether my understanding of it as a soft reboot really held water. And well, I'm happy to say that it largely does, and that's predominantly thanks to the character of Atreus and the way the developers weave his ignorance of his father into every aspect of the storytelling. When Kratos would temper his response, catch himself mid-sentence, or hide something from Atreus, it effectively put me, a new player, into his position. While older players get to stand in Kratos' shoes and no doubt feel the weight of Kratos' secret, it instead replaced it for me with Atreus' curiosity that I'd eventually see answered. From the puzzle interactions to the telling and deafening silences during exploration, it's all in service of bonding these characters to the player, and one of the first instances of this comes early on when Kratos refuses to let Atreus wield his own bow in the first encounter. And so it was finally my time to shine as a player.
Oh, fuck. Oh, I did the thing!
If you think Mark is dying a lot for a tutorial, well, you are not wrong. Early on, he effectively decided his only two moves were heavy throw and heavy attack if he was feeling spicy.
These early encounters were very overwhelming, and so any attempt at reading, let alone internalizing the tutorial pop-ups, just wasn't happening, but I think it's a little bit more than that.
In game design, tutorial pop-ups are really just the starting point, and it's how a game rewards or doesn't reward a player that truly hits home. It's basic positive and negative reinforcement, and God of War is full of this stuff. Even early on, using the correct tool or moveset against an enemy is visually and mechanically rewarded.
One of the earliest tutorials lets you know that using your fists inflicts stun damage, which allows for a special move when staggered. It then puts you up against an enemy with a lot of health, encouraging you to stagger it first, rather than spending an age chipping its HP bar down. Unfortunately, even on this harder difficulty, God of War isn't really challenging enough for that to be mandatory early on. So when Mark opted to heavy axe throw the enemies instead, they took a big chunk of damage, and Mark took this as positive reinforcement.
Of course, the flip side is negative reinforcement. Play incorrectly and you die. It's pretty simple. But in a cruel twist of fate, most of the times Mark died early on in this game came from him attempting basically any move other than his trusty heavy axe moves. Like here, for example. Mark's been throwing his heavy axe non-stop and quickly decides to try something new and use his fists. Sweet. This is specifically how this enemy is meant to be tackled. But instead of him picking up a quick kill and learning a valuable lesson, he's unfortunately insta-killed and hit with a tidal wave of negative reinforcement.
That is some killer bad luck mixed with, okay, questionable reading comprehension, and so with the mantra of punching bad drilled into his head, Mark stepped forth out of the gate, believing without a shadow of a doubt that only throwing the axe was the best possible option for every encounter.
Not the ideal start.
One thing I should make clear at this point is that God of War generously offers the player the option to alter the difficulty level at any point during a given playthrough, and while this was one of the few pieces of information I successfully read and understood, when it was offered to me, my innate stubbornness wouldn't allow me to even consider altering that difficulty setting. Come hell or high water, I was going to beat this game on hard mode. Why hello there, inciting incident. By this point, I was starting to wonder when the story was going to take off the kid gloves and really get going, and man did it ever in this encounter. This was such a kinetic and sudden change of pace, and despite dying a ton, I still had a lot of fun figuring out this character before snapping his neck and yeeting him into the abyss. But more than anything else, I love the pressure this puts on Kratos to take his son on this wild journey. At this point, the setup is simple but effective. There are clearly powerful enemies with their eye on Kratos, and both he and the boy need to reach the mountaintop to spread his late wife's ashes. For an inciting incident, you don't need much more than that. This is gonna be good. Despite choosing the hard difficulty and admittedly finding trouble in a fair few areas of combat, I was having a lot of fun navigating my way through all of these new enemies, albeit with my limited moveset. Now, I definitely felt like I was brute forcing my way through sections of the story that demanded something else of me, but what can I say? The menu scared the hell out of me. Look at all that information. Reading is for nerds. I will admit, however, that this brute forced approach doesn't exactly complement the story by any stretch of the imagination. Early on, there's this harrowing scene where Atreus kills something for the very first time. It's meant to be this touching moment where Kratos steps in to alleviate Atreus of responsibility while he deals with the shock of it all. And, well, I didn't have any health, having barely survived the preceding encounter, so this happened.
Wait here. I will handle this.
And speaking of dying, shortly thereafter I met the first of many mortal enemies, the giant trolls.
Mark's approach to this fight is baffling.
Yeah, he genuinely fought
And beat
a troll by only axe throwing. I think Mark might be a gamer genius.
Here we go. Here we fucking go. Fuck him up.
Mercifully, what follows that madness was one of awe and intrigue. Venturing through the woodland gave rise to the stunning vista of Freya's domain, a beautiful garden with a giant tortoise house packed full of colorful imagery and botany. To walk through this beautiful area and learn more of Freya the witch was a joy, and she quickly became positioned as a motherly figure for Atreus, still seeking his father's approval. And seeing this, it's hard not to love the dynamic these three have. And once again, Kratos' fatherly awkwardness gave rise to some amusing insights. He said, quote, "The dead don't have wants and needs." He says this in the midst of a journey honoring the wants of his deceased wife. Just gonna leave that one sit there. Bit ironic. But as this third day of gaming came to a close, I felt as though I finally stepped out of the tutorial zone and into the meat and potatoes of this game proper. Coming upon a sort of hub world, I guess? Somehow matching the awe of Freya's tortoise house came the reveal of the World Serpent. And through all of this, I couldn't help but be brought back to playing Halo 1. The emerging from the first level into the open world of the Halo ring. The scale of these creatures and the vastness of their environment was both startling and welcoming. And it was clear the reins were finally let loose.
I really wish I could say that Mark's adventures from this point all became one of awe and unwavering immersion, but alas, there existed a complication that surprised even us.
Controllers haven't fundamentally changed all that much since Mark last picked up a game, and any of the big new technologies aren't really applicable here anyways. Naturally, then, we just didn't really expect Mark to encounter any issues with the controls.
God of War does a very solid job of tutorializing the players on how to move, vault, attack, and interact with the world.
But there's one control that appears to have no tutorial pop-up.
The sprint button.
Unsurprisingly, it's on L3. Place I think a majority of people would expect it to be, given that's kind of been the standard since 2007. But for Mark, given the last two games he played with a sprint button were The Last of Us and Halo Reach, he figured it'd be on the left shoulder button.
This assumed knowledge obviously did him no good, and so not only was he playing on hard, he also walked
and rolled
through the entire game for the first 7 hours.
It's probably not surprising then that his early impressions of the world weren't entirely glowing.
Maybe it's because my progression was slow due to all the dying. But once the charm of the open world's visual splendor wore off, I discovered I really didn't find navigating around this world very enjoyable. In fact, it was more of a chore. Kratos felt a little slow and everything felt miles away. There are areas that felt enormously vast, yet all I had to do was beeline it to the other side with no enemies or obstacles in my way. Just me left with this slow jog and roll combination, violently tapping the X button for my best Sonic the Hedgehog impression. That said, the result of all of that travel was almost always worth it. The giant tortoise house and the sea serpent are video game visuals that will stay with me for the rest of my life, and now thanks to Freya, I was able to use this new bridge hub world area to access and launch into the first proper level. And my god, was it beautiful! The enemies were different and required an entirely new approach, though I did ignore that due to my inability to actually, play the game. But the navigation was even entertaining due to all of this crazy new architecture. Narratively, we're in the process of retrieving this metaphorical Poké Flute, the light, to move that proverbial Snorlax, the black smoke, blocking our advancement up the mountain. But who needs reasons to explore a new level?
This first foray into the equivalent of a dungeon really did open our eyes to a gap in Mark's video game intuition. With the scope of games growing ever larger and From Software's popularity pushing folding paths into all kinds of AAA games now, it can be a daunting experience for even seasoned gamers. Levels that wrap back around on themselves, worlds that encourage exploration into entirely optional areas. There's a whole world of navigational shapes and ideas that Mark was entirely ill-equipped to deal with.
In the mid to late 2000s, many of the levels found in Mark's gaming experiences looked largely like this. A linear path with a few dead-end forks to hide bonuses in. With simple geometry mapping out these zones, knowing where you could and couldn't go wasn't particularly hard. But now you've got these complex levels coupled with graphics that are designed to seamlessly hide the basic gray box layouts. Gamers often meme on the whole big yellow paint trend that pops up pretty often nowadays, but it's clear that that stuff is pretty vital for accessibility and playability.
While God of War doesn't shy away from this at times, its design language is a lot more subdued, and when combined with button prompts that require the aforementioned accuracy to even appear, this led to Mark getting lost a lot. I mean, he even got lost inside a linear loading tunnel at one point. How?
The pathways for this are annoying because they're all linked together, which makes kind of like checking every crevice, leaving no stone unturned, kind of difficult. Because you don't actually know which way is the right way, and if you go too far, you might accidentally trigger a, whatever.
The very literal light at the end of this confusing tunnel at least provided one hell of a story moment. Atreus was already starting to feel like a more confident character in how he was interacting with Kratos at this point, and Kratos seemed to be inching towards a better understanding of the boy. It really came to a head, however, when Kratos alone stepped into the light, hearing a devastating prayer from Atreus to his mother, only to reappear in what seemed like a moment to discover a big passage of time had passed. Surrounded by a sea of corpses that Atreus had butchered on his own, my jaw was on the floor. In other stories, the obvious would be stated here, but it's kept as a pure piece of visual storytelling as Kratos tends to his son. Definitely a highlight of some already very strong character writing. On the whole, this first detour was a delight to play through. The refreshing new setting, the plethora of different enemy types, and the story kicked up a notch. After around 8 hours of pretty linear progression, it was great to feel like I had my own agency for the very first time. Like I was taking my first steps onto the path of getting good. At least until I met him. My one true enemy, my arch nemesis of this game, the Joker to my Batman, the King Bee.
Every game has its roadblock, a single moment that stops players in their tracks and says,
These moments exist as a hard check on players' understandings and mastery of the mechanics presented so far. They're important not just from the sense of triumph that you feel when you win, but because they ensure players are up to the standard needed to progress through the difficulty curve the rest of the game has.
In a game like Sekiro, it's Genichiro. In God of War, it's the Dark Elf King. Or Bee King? King Bee, as Mark put it, I think.
Is it because he has wings? They have hives? Look, I don't understand. Don't ask me. I am not trying to peer into the mind of Mark. I'd imagine some of you might think we're exaggerating with the whole Mark only using 2 moves thing, but I can assure you we are not, and that his complete lack of fundamentals goes even deeper. he did not remember Kratos' invulnerable rage mode or its healing properties, and despite the game having a pretty overt segment dedicated to teaching the super moves called runics, he somehow only learned they existed minutes before this fight, and then had no real clue about their application.
This was the point the game said no more. With its aggression and mechanical complexities, there was no way he was brute forcing this. Mark simply had to get good.
Fucking hell! I dodged it! What the fuck? Oh my god!
Are you fucking kidding?
I have other things to be fucking doing than feeding this fucking grasshopper.
Well, okay, look, it didn't happen immediately, but he got there in the end. Learning all of this at once, trial by fire style instead of piece by piece at the beginning of the game, was overwhelming for Mark, which ultimately kind of just led to him struggling with them a bit even after learning them.
But ultimately, by doling out extra damage and healing with rage mode, seamlessly switching between axe combat, fist combat, and range combat when needed, utilizing runics on cooldown to dispense extra damage, Mark had all of these things mercilessly beaten into him over the course of literally 70 minutes straight of attempts. And let me tell you, as someone who suffered through hours of Mark's terrible gameplay up until this point, watching him learn and eventually overcome this fight was bliss.
Let me tell you, until now my gaming sessions had been about 90 minutes to 2 hours long. This one was 4 hours long. And no, not because I was having fun, because I had to fight and kill this fucking bee who kept charging me with unblockable, almost unavoidable attacks whenever his health got low. He wasn't even that hard up until then. The moment his health got to a certain point, he dropped the easy stuff and immediately spammed a charge attack that, I will conservatively guess, killed me about 1,000,000 times. For over an hour of that session, I fought this fucker, and while I may not have had fun, it did at least force me to better acquaint myself with the various modes of attacks and defense in this game. I even discovered the usefulness of the skill tree that I probably should have discovered a whole lot sooner than this. This whole area was just a tidal wave of lessons, and perhaps none more crazy than learning the game has a sprint button.
I can sprint. I'm so happy about this. Oh my god. I want to know, how long have I actually been able to sprint and I just didn't know?
This newfound movement was a real revelation to me, and while I still take issue with some of the lengthy distances this game makes me travel, it is way less egregious than my previous sprintless session had led me to believe. I guess onwards and upwards to the mountain now. Having told the bee bastard to buzz off and calm down, I realized I'd come away from that encounter with a newfound set of skills that meant progress was a lot smoother. Fewer deaths, greater progression per minute. My self-inflicted pacing issues started to fall to the wayside. In the games I grew up with, things were honestly a lot simpler. Crash Bandicoot had a jump attack and a spin attack. Halo had 2 guns, a grenade, and a melon. God of War feels like a totally different beast in comparison. Just an absolute host of buttons, button combinations, and swappable moves. By the way, so many of these moves combo together, and trying to keep track of this while also executing evasive maneuvers was a real adjustment and far beyond anything I'd encountered in a game prior. It's an incredibly deep and modular system, and while I had a lot of fun during the times I got things right, most of the time I just felt overwhelmed in the heat of battle. Coming up against the more formidable enemies whose mechanics left me unsure of what to even do, I found myself falling back on a smaller, reliable pool of techniques, which I guess just made things all the more difficult for me.
Yeah, God of War definitely has a lot going on, and for someone as unfamiliar with this genre like Mark, even the basic video game language of weak points posed an issue.
The dragon atop the mountain was a moment of spectacle Mark loved, but the actual mechanics of the fight were a real struggle. He intuited the idea of the bombs needing to go into the dragon's mouth pretty quickly, but once it was down, Mark struggled to recognize the fleshy opening as a weak point to hit, instead attempting to go inside the mouth?
so I gotta wait to get into his mouth every time now. What the fuck? What am I supposed to do here, exactly? I can't climb him. What am I supposed to do? What the fuck?
The point is that gamer intuition is forged with experience, and this is no more true than in this game's UI. While first acquiring runic attacks and skills did enforce a tutorial that opened the relevant menus automatically, returning to those menus proved to be a pain point. Opening that menu and navigating to weapons wasn't all that hard, but being presented with a vertical array of symbols accompanied by 3 columns of information was more than enough to overwhelm.
Clicking through into the runic options presents an eye-catching video on the right and an upgrade path beneath. That video is the most prominent element on the screen, while the UI element indicating how to actually use said runic is in a small floating menu in the center, above a row of statistics. This resulted in Mark often upgrading multiple runics to max and never actually equipping them. But most critically, he didn't spot the UI element telling him how to actually use them until 10 hours in.
While some of this is certainly Mark's fault for not carefully reading everything, I think it's also quite indicative of how questionable UI design can lead to hours of confusion, and considering the sequel moved all of that information into the center with every element clearly labeled, I think the developers would probably agree too.
With the dragon out of the way came a good chunk of story. Finally, free of the cursed icy dungeon, I got to reach the summit of this mountain. By eavesdropping on Magni and Modi, I learned that the stranger from the start of the game is Baldur, brother of Thor and son of Odin, except, oh, he's not dead, which, hey, makes sense if you remember Baldur is immune to all damage, but I'd forgotten that at the time, so I was immensely confused. Alas, the story then hit me with, your princess is in another castle, which didn't exactly fill me with joy. But I did behead a man stuck to a tree, and we became bestest buds, so that was cool, I guess. But jokes aside, with a near infinite amount of wisdom and utility, Mimir's introduction into the core cast is a real net positive on the whole experience.
I'm going to cut off your head now.
Fair enough.
Characters like Brock and Sindri had largely provided much needed levity up until this point, but with Mimir added to the cast, not only does he provide a great deal of in-world insight to freshen things up in navigation, but most importantly, Atreus has someone to bounce off of now. The moment he's introduced, the entire cast and world around them instantly feels so much more lively. I mean, what a guy. And so with my chatty new fashion accessory at my side, it was time to head off and find a magic chisel. Not the most thrilling concept, but the icy world it led me to helped make up for that. The area offered up a perfect opportunity to try out all these new moves I just discovered. And you know what? I actually did pretty well. All things considered, riding high on my newfound successes, I stepped forth into the ruins ready to mow down whatever the game threw at me. And then this guy appeared.
My God! Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm! Everybody stay calm!
Now, I thought I was out of the woods after conquering the King Bee dickhead, but this guy was about to teach me another lesson. How to block and parry. Up until now, every time my attempt to block and parry failed. I'd call bullshit and rage, convinced the game didn't acknowledge my button presses. But you see, in God of War, attacks that can be blocked and or parried are telegraphed with a yellow flash, while unblockable attacks flash red. I'm sure the game probably tried to teach me this at some point, but it never really settled in until now, where it forced me to listen. It took me a solid hour of fighting this Knight of the Round Anus to truly learn this lesson, but the simplicity of the encounter design actually made this a lot more satisfying for me. It was largely clear what I had to do, I just had to perfect doing it.
That was difficult.
The next major encounter after the Knight is the one and only Magni and Modi fight, and for those of you keeping score at home, I'm sure it won't be too surprising for you that this fight took Mark north of an hour to complete.
By this point, Mark had more or less gotten a solid grasp on most of the gameplay mechanics and was looking downright competent in his gameplay. Much of this fight was a real breeze, with Mark making full use of movesets and identifying which of the two brothers to prioritize first.
After a lucky few attempts, he managed to bring one of the brothers down, only to discover the most brutal mechanic of the fight. If you don't kill them both within a short time frame, that downed one will simply revive and heal up.
In most games, and even in fights later in this very game, this type of mechanic works by having a shared health pool. The downed enemy will revive by draining the health pool of the other, think Godskin Duo in Elden Ring. As long as you persevere, you will eventually beat them. But in this fight, the battle will simply run on endlessly until you execute the both of them within the same time frame.
The intended solution is to either be extra aggressive or stun both of them at the same time, but Mark never figured this out, and so instead fell back on brute force and a little bit of luck to overcome them. In any other fight, we'd probably be snarky and make fun of him, but this is genuinely brutal, so we'll let him have this one.
It's around here that the narrative kicks up a notch, and the simple tale starts to layer on the complexities that the finale hinges on. With the surviving Modi brother catching Kratos off guard, it sends Atreus into a rage, his inner power attempting to pour out only to leave him at the brink of death. Returning to Freya for help, she reveals that the source of Atreus' illness comes from within. His true nature, that of a god, fights within him. It's a moment that reveals the most central theme of the game and one that serves as an allegory to parenthood itself, something that resonates with me immensely. A core tenet of parenting is to protect your child, but to also ensure that they experience the realities of life to teach them how to deal with them. It's something every parent has to come to terms with, and it's hard to not feel the emotional weight as Kratos utters,
I did this to him.
I think what really sells this moment is that it's not just about Kratos protecting Atreus. It's about Kratos' own rejection of his past, and what better way to force him to confront it than to manufacture this forthcoming level. Kratos must set foot into Helheim to retrieve the antidote to Atreus' affliction, and to have any chance of succeeding, he must dig up his past. He must retrieve the Blades of Chaos. A majority of the next few hours draw from what I now understand to be the previous games, but for a newcomer like myself, this unveiling of the past is a scary revelation rather than presumably an awesome rush of nostalgia. As you take Freya's enchanted boat back home, the solemn journey is coupled with visions of Athena, someone unknown to me but a woman who antagonizes Kratos, insisting he cannot change who he is. And as Kratos wields the chains once more, she spits out that he will always be a monster. And like, this section is framed just so masterfully. It not only oozes with atmosphere, but it perfectly sets up the journey of discovery that follows. A trying trip, all for the sake of saving his child. In spite of all the baggage that so clearly lingers, Kratos taking up those daggers and jumping straight into hell is already a bold statement. One that echoes that he has changed.
I've always wondered how these segments would land for someone with absolutely no understanding of the original story. With this soft reboot framing the past as mysteries for Atreus and, by extension, newcomers, I figured Mark wouldn't be confused, but I did wonder if the core themes would hit quite the same.
But somehow, not only did Mark absolutely lap this section up, but it was seemingly one of his favorite parts of the game. A lot of the plot beats seemed to basically glaze over him, but he came away from this section chatting our ears off about Athena of all people. I don't entirely understand how he got there, but whatever.
Although the impact of the Blades of Chaos themselves was lost, the mechanical design around their introduction sure seemed to hit Mark pretty damn hard.
Now, if you thought I was starting to warm up to this game, let me just flip the script on you. On the way back home to retrieve Kratos' old weapons, the ice enemies that attack you make your axe completely useless. This worried me, this was my go-to, this was my baby, I didn't know what to do without the ice axe. Yet, as you emerge from the following cutscene, now equipped with your new, or I guess old, weapons, those same enemies appear once again, and man, it's crazy how empowering it is, absolutely melting through hordes of these annoyances with ease. It is a pure power fantasy and a design decision that really elevates this set piece. Unfortunately, my first adventure to Helheim did not come with quite the same feeling of immense empowerment, and you can lay all that thanks to these evil, endless, sword-slashing bastards. If I could go back in time, visit Santa Monica Studios' office, and stop any one mob from being designed ever, it would be these things. I don't know if I missed something, but my experience with these guys entirely boiled down to get stunned, get slashed, push every button to break free, and then die anyway. They were completely relentless, and the only way I got past them was by using rage mode. Somehow I had zero issue with the final boss of this level compared to these guys. Make sense of that if you can, but thankfully I made it out of Helheim alive and returned to Atreus, curing him and triggering a cutscene that kickstarted a fascinating marriage of gameplay and story. With Freya speaking of her own son that she lost due to her own overbearedness, Kratos opts to tell Atreus of their godhood.
I'm a god, boy.
Igniting a heightened ego that persists through much of this segment. While the extent of these two plot points are better suited for later analysis, the subsequent gameplay segment offered up a surprisingly different approach to the God of War formula so far. Instead of fighting waves of enemies, I was faced with A very annoying set of puzzles with a bunch of them feeling like something straight out of Crash Bandicoot.
Please understand that there is nothing here that is remotely like Crash Bandicoot, and for some reason Mark spent this entire 30-hour playthrough describing every puzzle this way.
Coupled with him on several non-consecutive occasions saying "no me gusta" completely unironically. Honestly, I think that his brain just reverted to the mid-2000s the moment he picked up a controller.
With the crazy, spinny, ceiling orby thing solved, this zone's narrative thread did at least cap off with a powerful cutscene that saw Kratos give Atreus a knife he crafted at his birth, telling him the importance of discipline and self-control. We must be better, he says. While I haven't remarked on the performances much so far, this was definitely a moment where I couldn't help but notice just how strong they've been.
The rune! Did you see it?
Wonderful! The game had to reward my bullying of its puzzle rooms with yet another incredibly difficult enemy encounter. While this took me somewhere in the range of an hour and a half to beat, this was probably the first time where I personally felt as though I had a handle on things. With each giant sporting fire and ice elements and myself holding weapons of the same type, the visuals alone pushed me to actually try out opposite weapon types on them. Over the course of those 90 minutes, I learned their movements like the back of my hand. Right out the gate, I managed to consistently deal more damage to one giant before the other even appeared. The main stumbling block came from their blinding rock mines, however. I won't lie that seeing their glowing eyes through the darkness is a cool touch, but I need to emphasize this. I hated this blindness mechanic so far. It not only blinded me in the game, it made me blindingly angry. It's easily my least favorite part of the game. So much so that these two brought me to a breaking point, bringing me to a full rage quit until I came back the next day. But, I kid you not, with a calmer, more level-headed approach, on my very first attempt on that day, I won.
Yeah! First time! That felt good. That felt really good. That felt really fucking good.
This was genuinely the most satisfying and exciting gameplay segment of the entire playthrough for me. It really felt like I had mastered the encounter and pulled it back with a win born not out of luck, but my own skills. I mean, could you imagine? Skills, me, I had them. 9 out of 10, highly recommended, points docked however for the stupid blinding rocks.
Ah, but who's worthy enough to judge?
Quiet, head. We are. We know better.
Alas, Atreus' literal god complex is reaching critical overload at this point, but I think it may well be my favorite narrative element within the entire game. It actively plays into the original fear Kratos appeared to have about Atreus learning of their true natures. In terms of narrative theory, what Kratos goes through here is something that's called a positive change arc. Within K.M. Weiland's book called Creating Character Arcs, she talks about something called, quote, the lie the character believes, which is essentially a flawed personal philosophy that guides a character's decision-making. For Kratos, it's his belief that all gods are bad and that rejecting them is the best and only choice he can make as a responsible father. He believes hiding the past he's ashamed of and his son's inherent nature will allow him to lead a normal life, far from what he's experienced. Again, a flawed philosophy, or a lie. And this is where God of War makes things interesting, because I think a lesser story would have followed up Kratos' revealing their nature to Atreus without consequence, maybe even as a moment of triumph. But God of War doesn't shy away from the ugliness of human nature and reality. Instead of it yielding a positive result, it immediately pushes Atreus into behaving precisely in the manner Kratos feared the most. But it's the perfect character drama to eventually teach Kratos the resolution to his character arc. And I really love the way that this concept was woven into the gameplay itself. Rather than being able to control Atreus' arrows and summons myself during this phase, he simply uses everything of his own volition. Of course, now this was probably meant to frustrate players and put them in Kratos' shoes, but I was so bad at juggling his moves early on, and okay, at this point in the game I was pretty bad too, that him doing them automatically was actually a massive relief for me. I was like, hey, thank you for taking responsibility, thank you for growing up, thank you for helping me without me needing to tell you every single last fucking thing. However, this all comes to a head through two devastating actions. The first comes through the third appearance of Modi, who Atreus murders in cold blood, spouting off against his father's attempts to discipline him. It's a moment I come to realize is reminiscent of Kratos' attitude in the previous game thanks to visions in a later level. But as it happens right here, I just never expected anything like this from the game. After battling through countless ogres and regenerating enemies, I finally made it back to the summit where the second surprise hit me. Baldur rears his head once again, destroying the passage to Yona. Okay, but before I could whine and begin to complain about the princess being in another castle yet again, Kratos is shot multiple times by his own son. After hours of rising tension, something had to happen. But Atreus firing on his own father was yet another thing I could never have seen coming. My jaw literally, in real life, dropped.
What the fuck?
And here I thought my
family. Oh my god.
The consequences of this action send the pair into Helheim once again. And it's here we learned the truth. The child Freya spoke of earlier was Baldur. The immortality that he despises so much came from her overprotective actions. It became clear that the character analysis I laid out earlier applies also to Freya and Baldur, just at different stages in their development. It really emphasizes the brilliance of it all, the intentional poetry. But Kratos and Atreus are forced to confront their greatest mistakes and flaws. And by the end of it all, Atreus is brought back to reality. Whoops, there goes gravity. Now carrying with him a greater understanding of his father's history. Hurtling towards the end of the game, unbeknownst to me, by far the biggest challenge laid before me. One that I still haven't entirely recovered from mentally.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the weirdest part of this video.
Yeah, after flipping Tyr's Temple, you're subject to a gauntlet of all the previous enemies you fought before. It's like a fun little victory lap before the final fight.
But fun for Mark this was not. Strap in and grab some popcorn because things are about to get real weird.
Introducing not one, but two Dark Elf Kings, or should I say Bee-Kings.
Prepare for trouble!
Make it double!
When I first saw that I had to defeat not one, but two Bumblebee men, alongside a bunch of floating eyeballs, I could feel my heart sink into an abyss the likes of which I still haven't fully recovered from. And hilariously, nothing, and I do mean nothing, in this game came remotely close to the level of difficulty I experienced with this bee bastard. Those bee people took hours of my lifespan that I will never get back.
The funniest part is, this encounter isn't even really designed to be that hard. It's only a small part of a much longer gauntlet. Yeah, you're facing two of a previous boss, but both of them are significantly weaker than the actual real version you fought earlier.
The encounter's designed such that the first of the kings is a level 3, and then the second is a level 5. You simply focus on killing the weaker one first, and then solo the level 5 with relative ease. But for whatever reason, Mark never really managed to pick up on the differing levels. To him, he was legitimately facing two of the very same boss from earlier in the game and getting absolutely annihilated as a result.
3 whole hours Mark spent fighting this encounter. 180 straight minutes of dying.
I think he might have gone clinically insane by the end of it. It went on for so long that he eventually developed a Southern American accent.
See, my problem right there was I was trying to target that done there fucking eyeball, and I got him, but wasn't what I was supposed to do in that moment.
And after legitimately 30 minutes of that accent, he devolved further into speaking the language of the elves? I know you're all fans of YouTube and you're probably watching this and thinking, oh, he's just playing it up for the camera, and I think that might actually be a better reality. The majority of his playthrough was actually quite quiet and clinical when it came to his reactions, because these were just captured in case we needed something.
Look, I genuinely think this fight broke him. When all was said and done, I don't think he even felt the tiniest tinge of satisfaction. You'd think when he finally prevailed, he'd pop off, but he was so tired and broken by the end that all that managed to come out was...
I am the Game Boy.
With the worst gauntlet of my life out of the way, I finally stepped foot into the finale, the final fight, Kratos versus Baldur, and you know what? It was fantastic to finally see Baldur's immortality spell broken not by some kind of contrivance, but by the very magical arrow Freya tried to dispose of earlier in the game. Tickled my narrative device loving brain something fierce. He was finally vulnerable, and what followed was definitely no easy fight for me, but one I was happy to say I understood from the get-go. It was a culmination of what the game's training moments had been teaching me. Ice for fire, fire for ice. Learn to parry, learn to dodge. And while I died over and over and over again, it felt good to finally conquer the game's final gameplay hurdle.
The cycle ends here. must be better than this.
I will parade your cold body from every corner of every realm and feed your soul to the vilest filth in hell. That is my promise.
He saved your life.
He robbed me of everything. Everything.
It's impossible not to notice the parallels of Baldur's attempting to kill his mother here with the visions of Kratos and Zeus in Helheim. That's what these characters are ultimately, an allegory, a cautionary tale for the path Kratos was marching down with his son Atreus. At every point in our lives, we have the chance to choose to be better than we once were, to not be defined by our past mistakes, but to instead learn from them. It's painful, but you have to accept that you've done wrong, but ultimately it leads you to growth and peace. And once the climax has subsided, the dust settled, and part of me genuinely began to fear the possibility of a battle with Thor himself on the horizon, given we just murdered his 2 sons earlier. But that didn't come to pass, and thank Odin for that! Instead, what we got was something much more profound. Something that was, for me, the most impactful and emotionally resonant part of the game. Its ending. After 30 hours of gameplay facing off against Thor's sons and Baldur, it's easy to forget their demise has never been the goal here. They were merely obstacles on a journey about putting a mother and wife to rest, to spread Faye's ashes atop the highest peak in the realms, Jotunheim, the land of the giants. And despite going through literal hell together, the game still had one last rug pull to deliver.
It's your axe. It's smaller.
This mural tells the story of their travels and reveals that Faye was not only a giant, but saw their story in advance.
This is our story.
No. This is your story.
Despite its understated delivery, Kratos' words here ultimately speak to the themes conveyed and lessons learned across the game incredibly succinctly. And as Atreus runs ahead, the emphasis on his part of this tale only grows stronger as Kratos unveils a second drawing, one that tells the future. Emblazoned on the tomb wall is Kratos, dead in his son's arms. However, instead of meeting this prophecy with fear or anger in his voice, instead there's quiet acceptance. Why? Well, as I established at the beginning of this game, I think people come into this through 2 lenses. One of fatherhood and one of a child looking to his father. And while the mysteries of this story often put me in Atreus' shoes, and as a new father myself, this was one of the moments that Kratos' reaction really spoke to me. Were I faced with this future, I too would have had that reaction. As Kratos said, this isn't his story, it's Atreus's. So much of this story has been about accepting that you cannot protect your children from all the realities and horrors of life. I think this scene is an extension of that philosophy, an acceptance of the inevitable, that this is a fact of life, of his life. Parenthood is hard, for any parent. We all struggle with different elements of it, and from the beginning of this game, Kratos has exhibited plenty of flaws in his own approach, in many ways refusing to be a father outright. But now, at the close of this game's story, Kratos has changed. A once reluctant hand now lovingly finds comfort on Atreus' shoulder. Kratos, for the first time in the game, refers to him as his son, and together they get to spread the ashes of Faye, finally as father and son, fully accepting and understanding what this relationship means. That one day, not regretfully, but hopefully, his son will be alive and strong enough to eventually lay him to rest. Part of fatherhood is preparing your children for your funeral, to be strong enough to weather any storm no matter the circumstances. I don't believe Kratos wants to die or leave his son behind, but he accepts that this is the natural order of things, which is honestly just a thunderously emotional footnote and resonant message that is reinforced moments later in the game's true ending following the completion of the main story's goal. But what are my final thoughts? Well, despite the game's emphasis on story, it's the gameplay that really ended up being the focus of my journey here. Primarily because this is a genre of game that was completely new to me, but also because learning the ropes really was a decent amount of fun. As I made my way up to the top of that literal and proverbial mountain, it was hard not to feel genuine catharsis at having conquered it. With Thor on the horizon and the mysteries of Atreus' origin now left hanging, I've no doubt that its sequel will have its own fair share of equally resonant themes to explore. If I could go back, I would definitely play this game a lot differently, and I think I would have a lot better of a time as a result. But as I look back over what this story offered me, I find so much more to appreciate than what I experienced while in the midst of playing it. This is a story that very obviously came from a son or father that had something profound to say on the subject. And in my view, as a father, they absolutely knocked it out of the park.
Throughout this whole game, a running theme has been Mark's unfamiliarity with modern games, resulting in him having a much harder time than he should have.
Picking hard mode to begin with kicked that off, and fighting entire bosses with only axe throws towards the start only added to it.
But the level of accidental challenge run that Mark inflicted on himself goes even further than what we could fit in this video. Right through to the credits, Mark seriously struggled with the menus in the game. God of War lays most of its systems, moves, and upgrades at the feet of the player and allows them to rifle through and use what they please.
But Mark never really came to grips with any of that. By his own admittance, readings for nerds, and let's not even get into the irony of that coming from Mr. I only read manga. When Mark first received the blades, he didn't equip the runic for them because it required one extra button press, and he actually played the next 7 hours or so without a single light runic for those blades.
When Mark first encountered enhancements, the cheap permanent upgrades to your stats available in item shops, he glazed over them and didn't buy a single one until his second to last day playing the game.
He also didn't discover that you can toggle the rage mode on and off to conserve that resource until right at the very end. Throughout this entire game, he only got the 2 mandatory health and rage meter increases. He missed tooltips for boss fights, basic weak points, the list goes on and on and on. Due to his total inexperience with this type of game and, to be honest, his complete lack of desire to read anything, Mark basically played this entire game as a quadruple hard challenge run.
But what's most interesting here is how he felt about all of this. As you heard from him, there were obviously masses of frustration in the fights themselves, but through it all, Mark had absolutely no desire to make it any easier, to lower the difficulty, or cast blame on the game for his failures. Okay, well, he did blame the game a couple of times, but admittedly those were some pretty bad hitboxes. The point being, in Mark's eyes, the difficulty he was experiencing was the intended experience of this game.
His problem with his deaths was never that he died. He was either swearing at himself for not having the requisite skill set, or swearing at the game for not adhering to its world's rules and having him fail for what he perceived as unfair reasons.
Despite spending literally 3 hours straight fighting a boss that literally wasn't a boss, Mark walked away from the game as a whole with a mostly positive outlook.
Which seems genuinely insane. If I had experienced God of War the way Mark did, I 100% would have broken my PlayStation in two and sworn off gaming forever.
Yet, at the end of it all, Mark liked God of War, but most critically, he didn't love it. Our journey to have him fall back in love with games is clearly just nowhere near its conclusion. But rather than laugh at Mark for his inability to read, or place blame with God of War for its slightly questionable UI patterns, we've chosen to take away something far more interesting from all of this.
Somehow through it all, persevering over impossible odds, mastering encounters, and having the world of the game live and breathe by its own rules were consistently the parts of the game that Mark enjoyed the most. And simultaneously, things like the vast array of button combinations, lack of agency within the world, and the rules of the game changing to fit an encounter were the things that he disliked the most.
So if Mark wants a challenge, one that takes place in a world of his own making, in a world that establishes its own rules and plays by them to a T, where your moveset is limited but still full of depth,
then I think naturally there's one obvious place to go from here.
Jeez, I fucking hit that thing. It was fucking hard. Fuck.